Okay, so now we should start. It's great that you are kind of came back quite just in time in the shortened break. It was surely kind of challenge to get the fast back in the room, and we largely succeeded. So to all of you, again, a warm welcome now to the next section, section number 3, and it's the short presentations, political violence, with the title Political Violence, Political Solutions, where we have young, promising scholars presenting their work and discussing with you their work. And just one sentence to me. I'm Matthias Bös. I'm a professor of sociology here at the Institute of Sociology, and what makes things even worse, I'm a professor of theoretical sociology, which leads to the problem that I often ask totally abstract questions with a kind of a problem. Be it as it may, we now have the chance to kind of talk again about this, the general theme is just on the one hand these kinds of social organization of violence, the differences between the kind of low-level zooming in perspective and the kind of more general global perspective, and how in this perspectives different borders, frontiers, these are all these kind of metaphors that came up when we talked about different conflict systems, how they are, what the dynamics of that. And we kind of go on with this topic here in this session. It's as well about boundaries, the transformation of boundaries, and even the blurring of boundaries, though not only the kind of that they are strengthened or something like that, but that they are as well strategically weakened, or that it is an aim to kind of blur these boundaries again. In different topics, we will listen to aspects of gray zones, gray areas. We will see what the role of the police in consolidating boundaries, for example, and last not least, we will spend some thoughts of the role of cultural representations when it comes to different border structures or blurring boundaries or drawing new boundaries. The format of the session is slightly different than the format of the former session. We have 3 presentations, and it's kind of organized like a scholarly speed dating. That means that we have a short presentation of about 8 minutes or something like that, and then we were going to have equally short discussions, a few questions from the audience with 8 to 10 minutes as well. And then we move on to the next date in this case. And it's the same as with speed dating in other contexts. It's a lot of fun and it's interesting, but the key to success is keep it short and sweet. Okay, so let's start with Nicolas Kologlou. He will be talking about his topic, but first some remarks to his life. He received his PhD in political science at the University of Sorbonne, Paris Nord. He is currently adjunct professor at Avignon University, and during his PhD, he specialized on this question of gray areas in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia especially. And he kind of explored the phenomenon of violence between state and non-state actors, which is, as we already finished heard in the last discussion, at the end of the last discussion, a very complex but very important issue. And his research interests in general fall within the intersection of migration and border security policies, in the US and in the EU borderlines. Okay, and he's going to talk about the new typology of gray areas in Mexico and Colombia and beyond, challenging state dominance. Okay, so it would be great if someone could switch on the presentation, and I will hand over the word to Nicholas. Feel free to start.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Walls. First and foremost, I would like also to thank Dr. Heinrich Onken, Professor Hadji, and Gina Tila, and all the organizers of the Congress. To begin with, what are the concepts and the new types of gray areas, and how exactly do we deal with violence in such circumstances? So my presentation today is divided in 3 parts. First, I will share with you some general aspects of gray areas. In the second part of my presentation, I will speak about the interviews and my qualitative findings that led me to this new typology of gray areas. And at the end, I will share some of the conclusions and hopefully some food for thought for the discussion part. First of all, let's talk about the concepts of gray areas. I will use 2 main references. Xavier Roffet, a French researcher in geopolitics and criminology, in an article published in 1992, and then in a collective book published in 2006, was the first one to define such areas. And for him, actually, there are sectors not covered by radar scanning in the vocabulary of aeronautical control. Such a zone can designate territories beyond any state control, where one or more forms of organized crime are flourishing, on the borders of politics, like the guerrillas, for example, in Colombia, and common law, like the general traffickers. So later on, in 2011, another researcher in political science, Gais Minassian, introduces the concept of state-centric gray areas in Colombia under the FARC dominance, and the socio-economic gray areas in Mexico under the dominance of criminal organizations or Mexican drug trafficking organization, MDTOs, as we say, and that's where exactly my research was focusing on. Indeed, the first type is based on war, political violence, and protest. Either it is a question of disintegrating the state, whose authority the illegal armed groups no longer recognize, or it is a question of overthrowing the regime without completely breaking the state structure. The second type focuses mostly on organized crime and its socioeconomic aspects, where the lure of profit predominates without questioning the integrity of the state. And such an examples we can see in the hands of mafia in Italy, Albania, the Golden Triangle, or in the hands of violent gangs in US, Mexico, and also in the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. So what was I examining through this research was mostly the factors that gave rise to such areas in Mexico and Colombia. And I thought that the existence of gray areas was depending on certain criteria, such as the fragility of the state, the strength of the rule of law, the extremity of violence, the war economy, and poly-trafficking, and finally the militarization of the state. 2 were exactly, 2 crucial were the converging elements between the MDTOs and the FARC dominance. First of all, the significant extent of territorial control in both countries by these armed non-state actors. And second, the weak or almost non-existent rule of law in these areas. And an additional element was actually their durability over time and the longevity linked to their military power. And then so the hypothesis that I argue was that, first of all, the security and the political context in both countries allowed the emergence of such areas, but also the policies that were adopted by the Mexican and Colombian governments to deal with such areas perpetuated this phenomenon. So, moving on to the new typology of gray areas, I introduce these two new terms, the gray areas of physical presence in Colombia and the gray areas of non-physical presence in Mexico. So, for the term of physical presence in Colombia, for me, it designates an area controlled by legal armed groups that deploy their supporters or fighters in the occupied territory. There is also an organic, let's say, connection with the territory, which presents sometimes a power or a weakness to them. And then for the term gray areas of non-physical presence, here we can speak about illegal armed groups that do not need to be physically present in the control area. There is no, most of the times, organic attachment to the area, and this control is more based on violence or the threat of violence, corruption, or intimidation without having exactly the control of the land. So we can speak about a kind of pseudo-territorial control. But what was exactly the political and security context of the rise of gray areas? In the first case, the FARC had occupied these areas to challenge the state and the policies of the conservative and liberal parties, particularly in the agrarian sector and in the issue of land redistribution. However, in Mexico, criminal organizations do not seek to challenge the state because they need it to develop their parallel economy, the parallel criminal economy. And my analysis actually was mostly focused on two periods, between 1998 and 2016 in Colombia, and between 2006 and 2018 in Mexico. So moving on the part two, actually I conducted around 30 interviews in 2016, the first part, 2017, and in late 2017, 2018, the second part in Colombia, and I will share with you some of the I regrouped some of the questions that I asked my interviewees. In the first part, in Mexico, actually the questions were based on the developments in the national security system and policy making from 2012 onwards, on the contribution of the newly formed Mexican National Gendarmerie and the US contribution in the fight against organized crime. Third was the territorial control of three conflicted regions in Mexico, Triángulo Dorado, La Sierra de Guerrero, and Ciudad Juárez. And the fourth category was mostly developments on arms trafficking and structural changes of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations. In the second part, in Colombia, the questions were focused more in the territorial control of the FARC and their implication in drug trafficking, on the reasons that constituted the FARC as the longest and more powerful guerrilla in Latin America and the world. The third group of questions were focused more on the democratic security policy of Álvaro Uribe and the security for prosperity of the next president, Juan Manuel Santos, and of course, peace negotiations and peace agreement. What about the findings? So the Colombian interviewees actually were familiar with the term and the concept of gray areas, which analyzes and explains the territorial control of the FARC and their criminal activities, more on drug trafficking and kidnapping. But actually, the Mexican interviewees did not all agree on the concept of gray areas. Some of them believed that the state could enter whichever area wanted by deploying the armed forces of the police to disrupt the dominance of the Mexican criminal organizations. And instead, other interviewees believe that when they understood the concept, they agreed that there are areas in which the term can be applied. And there was an ambiguity between the research. So actually, from this point of view, the thought of the concept of gray areas of non-physical presence emerged. And indeed, from that point, I was trying to explain the phenomena of territorial control and of Mexican drug trafficking organization and their functioning in the area. And I will try to conclude with two maps to see here actually the expansion of the FARC from 2002 to 2017. And here I will share with you the current map in Mexico for the organized crime. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Is this what? Yeah. Yeah, thank you, and great that you kept the time quite accurately. This was a great thing to do. So now we have time for. No, we do direct questions. I think. Okay. Are there any, or there are surely some questions, remarks on the presentation? Over there, in the last row. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, like you mentioned that you did your gray areas in Ciudad Juárez, which I think that it does apply, the term. And I don't know if you found out, like when you were mentioning at the end that people believe that they can get in, or the government can order and deploy the army or the police force and then expel the drug cartels from the zone. I was wondering what was the reaction of people in Juarez, or if you or if they mentioned something about it, because in at least my experience, it was that when the army and the police force enter, they cause even more chaos and more crime, and they got together with the drug cartels. So I don't know if you got some of these responses, and actually we had more black areas than gray areas probably.
Hello.
You could just speak, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Yeah, actually, as we were speaking yesterday with some of your colleagues from Ciudad Juárez, the problem was that apparently people do not trust the federal police, and they supposedly trust more the military to intervene. But actually, that was one of the parts that I couldn't present in my presentation. It was that the policies implemented and adopted by Felipe Calderón to implicate directly the army in this kind of fight against organized crime perpetrated the violence. And actually, the problem was that the Mexican cartels were fragmented into small gangs that were uncontrolled. And that's why we have an expansion in all over the country these days. So actually, in Ciudad Juárez, for me, the problem was that this kind of perpetuated violence couldn't be stopped by just a military presence of the state, because there were no consolidation of this state. There are no communication, there's no an institutional presence of the state. So that, for me, was a problem that perpetuated this kind of gray or black areas, as you say. Thank you.
question? Yeah, Wolfgang, it's over there.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I would ask, what would follow from your differentiation between these two types of gray areas with respect to solutions or dealing with these kind of violence?
What will follow? Okay. We can see from let's say from the historical events of term of events, actually the peace negotiation in Colombia changed a little bit the idea, and actually the Professor Dietz mentioned that the concept of territorial peace that Juan Manuel Santos introduced. So in Colombia and Mexico, we can see actually the different kind of term of events in dealing with violence. But for example, for Colombia, this new concept was introduced after the demobilization of the FARC. But actually today we can see that other groups are going to benefit from the void that the FARC left behind. New military groups, the dissidents of FARC, the ELN, other let's say, organized groups, armed non-state actors. In Mexico, it's quite different because the problem is that after the militarization that was implemented by Felipe Calderón between 2006 and 2012, and then the president Enrique Peña Nieto from 2012 to 18, actually the problem was perpetuated. And the emblematic case of the kidnapping and assassination of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa mostly, let's say, give me the chance to prove my theory that actually there was no physical presence of the armed groups, but at the same time is some parts of the Mexican state, of the Mexican institutions like military or police, that they are directly implicated in such affairs. So that's the problem, is the problem of corruption, the problem of how the institutions actually are really not working, as the colleagues of Africa said before, in terms of providing security, but they are providing insecurity. So I think that, okay, the current president of Mexico decided to implement a different kind of policy in these aspects, to try to find peace with organized crime, to have less assassinations and homicides. But for the time being, I'm not sure that it is capable to do it without investing in education, in programs of against violence, like in Juarez, on different kind of aspects and factors, to be more present institutionally in such areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
I have a question for him.
Yeah, sure. So start.
Okay. This works, yes. Following up that question, I wanted to ask you two things. The first one is, how do you see the use of this concept of gray areas in the implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia? What do you think it would happen and how can be useful? And the second is related to your comparative reading. I recognize what is happening now in Mexico with the process that happened in Colombia in the 80s. So what do you think are the similarities and differences of those processes? And given the Colombian history of drug dealing, do you think there is like a historical pedagogical process for the Mexico drug dealing problem?
So the first question was on the
gray areas.
how they can be applied in the okay. So I'm not quite optimist. Let's say for the concept of territorial peace in Colombia, because actually we can see that the FARC are not physically present in to the extent that they were before. But the new threats, the new actors that they are going to occupy these areas, I'm afraid they do not have actually this attachment organic that I say to the area. It means that they do not have maybe this, let's say, because it was a control of the land, but at the same time it was a control of the population. That not exactly manipulation of the population, but mostly that people were living there, in most cases, they accepted the dominance of the FARC because they believe that actually the state is not here, so these people are going to let's say, to substitute the state in many aspects, in education, in hospitals and everything. So right now, actually, with the change of the government with Duque, this concept of the territorial peace, for me, it went backwards. And I don't know if, maybe you know better, Petro probably is going to apply that, but I'm not that quite optimistic because it also has many dimensions, like the change of the cultivation, so the coca leaves and everything have to be eliminated, and they are proposing like alternative cultivations that they are not going to lead into violence, but I'm not going to be sure because the profit is too high. And as for the second question, I think the difference between Mexico and Colombia, there are many differences for me. The first one is that in the 80s and beginning of the 90s, actually the Colombian government was really focused on the elimination of Escobar and the Cartel of Cali. And right here you can see in Mexico the problem is not like this because not everybody is quite agreed on how to deal with the drug violence. So Calderon decided to attack directly, which was not the case before because the PRI was controlling the narco trade without violence. But then the militarization actually fragmented the different cartels into small gangs that they are not depending on anyone. So it's very, let's say, complicated to just say that we are going to attack, we are going to do that. It's not that simple, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm afraid we have to move on to our second presentation, and we are now pleased to listen to Joaquin Sayac. He earned his master in social anthropology at the Institute of Economics and Social Development in Argentina. He holds a PhD in social sciences from the Universidad de Buenos Aires and is currently associated professor of research methodology at the University of Salvador. His research and publications are mainly on security policies and violence management in poor urban areas. And when you look at his CV, he participated in numerous research projects, especially on technology transfers and dissemination of scientific knowledge. So the floor is open to you, and you will now going to talk about pacifying neighborhoods, consolidating borders, the presence of the Argentine National Gendarmerie and its impact on southern area of Buenos Aires. Great.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Leibniz University and the Volkswagen Foundation for this opportunity, and especially to Hinok and all the people from the organization. Thank you very, very much for making this event possible. I'm going to present some results of my recently defended doctoral thesis about focused police deployments of Argentinian National Gendarmerie in the southern area of Buenos Aires. I would like to begin my presentation with a scene from the ethnographic fieldwork that constitutes the main empirical input for my thesis. According to the gendarmes, scenes like this were no strange exception, but a fundamental part of their daily work. I was one morning at a police checkpoint, one of the many that the Argentinian National Gendarmerie has in the poor neighborhoods of southern Buenos Aires, talking with 3 police officers, when suddenly a young girl approached to the checkpoint, screaming that her baby had been stolen. The 3 officers and I followed the girl through the corridors of the neighborhood until we reached the girl's shack. We climbed the staircase to a second-floor apartment, and upon entering the living room, I was confronted with a totally unimagined scene. The one who had stolen the baby from the girl was her ex-mother-in-law, who wanted to force the young woman to take her son to the hospital because the child had a bad cough. Then, far from sanctioning the lady or calling the prosecutor's office, the gendarmes proceeded to mediate the conflict, convincing the girl to listen to her ex-mother-in-law, since it could be seen that she obviously loved her like her own child. The situation, on one hand, ended without any additional violence episodes, but also without any other deeper solution to the problem. So the question I asked myself is, what does this situation tell us about the demands and the problems and the conflicts in these vulnerable territories defined as margins and spaces beyond the control of the state, and also about the role of the police in such territories? No problem. When I started my research, my star hypothesis, based on the revision of global and local previous literature, was that the main conflict of those territories was drug dealing problems and crime problems, and also that the main and almost only effect of these security policies was to increase the levels of state violence against poor populations. As literature says, a violent power device for reinforcing socioeconomic inequalities typical of late capitalism. At the end of my research, I found that these insights from the previous study are indeed true, but also, and this will be the focus of my exposition, that those territories have other problems, like especially interpersonal violence in the daily basis, and that the police activity in such poor urban areas defined as beyond the control of state may have an impact that goes beyond repression, a productive role strongly linked with the dealing with violence matter that we are discussing today. Regarding the gendarmerie, briefly, it is a security force with military characteristics. For decades, it was part of the army, but since the return of democracy to Argentina in '83, it is no longer. It's a border police. Both in the strict sense, it is mostly destined to the control of international borders, and in the broad sense, it is usually deployed in rural or urban areas where usually there is no other presence of state agencies. It has an extensive repressive record of indigenous people in its origins, in the illegal repression during the many military dictatorships we have since '55 to '83, and in the repression of social protests, especially during the uprise of neoliberalism policies during the '90s. However, it has recently added new competencies that made this strictly repressive profile more complex, especially the participation of the force in United Nations peacekeeping missions, and also the case analyzed here, the focused deployment in poor urban neighborhoods, replacing local police forces whose performance were very deficient, corruption, brutality, and also especially omission of intervention in interpersonal conflict situations. Regarding the southern area of Buenos Aires, as you can see in the first maps, poverty distribution, the southern part of our capital city is by far the area with the highest level of socioeconomic and urban vulnerability. It is also the area that concentrates the highest proportion of lethal violence episodes, as you can see in the third map. If we focus inside those maps, this difference between North and South, both on poverty and violence, are, as you can see, explained by these little territorial spots called villas de emergencia. Villas de emergencia, well, they are slums in English, I think it's a correct word. They are irregular urban plots apart from the urban layout of the city, with narrow corridors which no vehicle can pass through. They are also characterized by the low quality of housing construction materials, the absence of essential public services, the high population density, and the low labor qualification and informality. Regarding my methodological approach, my work was, as I said before, mainly ethnographic, a participant of observation fieldwork with gendarmes, and with political, social, and community activists, neighbor, and state workers between 2016 and 2019. As the main theoretical framework, I rely on the perspective of government or governmentality crafted by Michel Foucault, whose main asset for this research was the conception of power as a practice of conduct of behaviors in a broad sense, not only with coaction, prohibition, repression, or punishment. Well, about or regarding the findings of my work, on the one hand, as I said before, I was able to see how the gendarmerie deployment effectively implies levels of state violence, especially against the poor and young male that are inhabitants of those neighborhoods. But also, as I already anticipated, a whole productive dimension of this deployment that must be addressed and debated. Response to emergency situations at specific times and places where no other state or community organizations provide an effective response. Separations and mediations in different conflict situations, gender violence, family and domestic conflicts, neighborhood conflicts, conflicts linked to urban disputes, in which the alternative resolution would maybe the exercise of lethal interpersonal violence. And finally, the protection provided to different state and community services and agencies so they can enter and work inside the neighborhoods. Finally, I also observed some obvious limitation of this productive sense of police activity, of gendarmerie intervention. A strictly police point of view, obviously, because in most of the cases, the officers are constantly seeking for punitive prosecution, which is not always the best way to resolve these problems. The lack of more deep integration with the justice system. I observed in my fieldwork that gendarmerie has a great local legitimacy to intervene and stop the immediate danger, but afterward, this does not imply a real access to justice for these marginalized populations. And finally, the lack of multi-agency articulation with other state or community agencies specialized in this conflict and demands that would address them in a more comprehensive way. So, pending question and debates for this meeting, the question I think is the most relevant for the debate we are having today is what should and should not be the role of police forces in a dealing with violence public policy. I personally believe that police may indeed have a role to play because they are the best to, for example, stop many situations of violence, preventing them from turning into episodes of potential lethal violence. But without a specialized intervention that addresses the deep roots of those conflicts, and I would add, without a radical improvement in the living condition of these marginalized populations, the same situations will be repeated daily and eventually may have a much more serious outcome. I leave the rest of the questions for the debate section. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So now we have some time, a little bit of time for questions, remarks. Over there is a hand and
Thank you so much for your interesting work. My question is related to the issue of race, and you mentioned that a lot of the violence is focusing on young, on young males that are usually that are poor, But I was wondering also how race comes into play. I mean, the political life in Argentina has been shaped by the narrative that Argentina is a white nation, that the Afro-descendant population was eradicated as early as the beginning of the 20th century, but new research is showing that that is just a myth and that there is a very vibrant Afro-descendant population that populates a lot of these more marginalized neighborhoods. So I was wondering if you are taking race into consideration on your study.
Thank you.
You can just talk, I think.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's a quite complex question. Maybe we can talk further after the presentation. Argentina indeed has a problem with race, and it's quite of non-talk issue, because we really think that we don't have that race problem. But the thing is, for example, the gendarmes, the police officers I did my fieldwork with, they are also very racialized people. They come from the rural areas of our country, so they have indigenous origins, for example, and the same skin color as the young male that they constantly stop and harass. So there is indeed a problem with race, but more complex because the same police is involved in the same race, the people they stop. So it's a kind of a mix or intersectional trouble between class and race, and also like rural or urban origin, and the very stigma of live in this marginalized neighborhoods. So it's quite more complex. But yes, I appreciate your comments anyway.
Yeah, thank you. There was another question in the last row over there.
Very much for the for the presentation. I have a question which maybe you can answer. How are the accountability relations around those gendarmerie? So basically, who do they account to? Who has any influence over them? Is there any bottom-up holding to account of them? And the second, I was triggered by the label that's given to these places, the villas de emergencia, and I was wondering if it means emerging or emergency places in these cases, and it led me to the question, how are those places? So what's the broader, let's say, discourse around them? Like, thinking also of yesterday, are they seen as dangerous places where the first, let's say, public effort is about containing the threat they might pose to the rest of the city? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting questions. About the matter of accountability, well, it's quite complex. In the beginning, when these deployments began, they did it in the inside of a public policy called Seguridad Ciudadana Democrática, or Democratic Citizenship Security, and one of the main points of that policy was the participation of community and social organizations. But after a few years, the participation, the community participation side, like ceased to exist. and now it's more like the gendarmes, for example, they have links with community activists. Some community activists support the presence of gendarmerie. And also, mainly the accountability, I think, goes through the activism, the human rights activism, the social organizations activism. There are a lot of social organizations inside those neighborhoods, organizing the people and struggling against police abuse. And they had a very important effect. The young male really became more informed about their rights and about what the police can and can't do, and it really changed the scenario from a few years to now. About the second question, the name of Villas de Emergencia, it's very, very interesting question also. I think that the original sense was like those places were something temporary, something that people need to use in order to immigrate to the city and then find a place, a better place to live. Now, in late capitalism, we know the system produces all the time a mass of population that is not going to integrate in the system, or, well, that's what I think. And the neighborhoods became more permanent, and yes, all these focused deployments has a lot to be in the sense to prevent these spaces to expand or grow or come out of control. One concept is very important of my work is the notion of pacification. It's like an hybridization of military and police and social policies to keep some populations defined as dangerous or above or beyond social, state control to keep the population peacefully and controlled and inside some borders and boundaries. I think this is a very important sense of this politics. I think that's all. Or do you have any third question? No, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm afraid that we have to move on. Thank you, Joaquin. And now the floor is open to Carolina Sanchez. She Carolina is currently a PhD student in Latin American literature and culture at Rutgers University. She's a Fulbright scholar and has a MA in literary criticism and a BA in philosophy from National University of Columbia. And she's one of the editors of the Latin American Platform of Environmental Humanities. Among her recent publications is Land and Shade, Haptic Cinema, Environmental Violence and Forced Displacement in Colombia. And her main research areas are transitional justice, post-conflict societies, and there she's focusing, and I think this is quite intriguing, on the relation between violence and culture. Feel free to start, Carolina.
Thank you very much for Professor Matías Boll for the presentation. Thank you, Professor Hiner Honken, for the organization, Tina Gealda, and everyone that was involved in the organization of this symposium. I am very happy of being here. I will present on how can culture overcome violence, and I will do a comparative reading between contemporary Colombia and Mexico. The relationship between culture and violence, and even the definition of both, is central for. The relationship between culture and violence, and even the definition of both, is central for the processes of transitional justice in countries like Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela in the region of Latin America. In this presentation, I will address this relationship based on the series Orinoco by the Colombian photographer and writer Juanita Escobar from 2018, and the novel Cotton Autobiography from 2020 by the Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza. My main thesis is that while both artists denounced the culture of extractivism that generates violence in the borders, to confront violence, Juanita Escobar highlights the need to restore reciprocity in the territory according to indigenous cosmovisions. And Cristina Rivera Garza rewrites the history using critical fabulation by including the silenced and erased bodies and histories of her own family in the archive. These works demonstrate that environmental violence is a type of political violence that occurs at borders in particular. The environmental violence consists mainly through the neocolonial extractivism of natural, human, and cultural resources. Nixon characterizes environmental violence as slow violence that occurs outside the radar and parameters of what we usually recognize as violence. It is not a single event, it lacks spectacularism, and it is not explosive, instantaneous, or sensationalist, but occurs gradually. It is composed of calamities and catastrophes with long-term effects dispersed in time and space, according to Rob Nixon. This violence is due to complex causal chains, such as free trade agreements, alignment between states and corporations in different geographies, gradual precariousness of labor conditions over several generations in places considered far away or invisibilized. I align myself with the argument of environmental humanities, which rejects the binary distinction between nature and culture. I explore aesthetic systems as sensitive devices that allow us to perceive and critique political and environmental violence, as well as to contribute to its confrontation. The Argentine philosopher Luciana Cadaya explores the notion of device from an aesthetical political perspective based on Foucault. According to her, a device is a, open quote, material operator of power that produces techniques, strategies, and form of subjection and subjectivation, end of quote. These aesthetics devices that are the works of Cristina Rivera Garza and Juanita Escobar allow us to perceive and recognize the presence of new political agents. Likewise, the devices generate a field of affective freedom that allows a disposition or a state of mind to act in the world. These works of art generate new witnesses for violence that can contribute to political solutions in the context of transitional justice. I will begin with Juanita Escobar. Up is the photographer. This is the book I will speak about, and this is one of the photos of the series. Escobar's photographs and narrations are full of textures that need a web of shifting. The visual narrative Orinoco by Juanita Escobar is a vortex of stories. The book consists of 38 photographs and 104 fragments, along with the photographer's chronicles and other materials. The Orinoco River is a contested territory. Forced displacement is one of the consequences of the 60-year Colombian Civil War, which has left 8 million people displaced inside the country, according to the UN and the Colombian government in 2019. On the other side of the border, the crisis in Venezuela has left 3.6 million displaced, according to the same sources. Contested notions of territory are conveyed in Escobar's photographs, which play with color and framing. In many images, the waters of the river are brown and look like earth. In other pictures, the water is golden, recalling the colonial dreams of wealth that continue through neocolonial extractivism of gold and other resources. You can see this in some of the photographs of the river. Escobar's photographs and narrations are full of textures that need a web of shifting affective and political relations. The political relations occur between humans and non-humans and allow the spectators to witness ontological openings, alluding to Marisol de la Cadena's leitmotif, not only. The river is not only a river in the scientific accounts we know. In the cosmovisions of the woman that live by the Orinoco, the river is a member of the community. It is an entity that participates in the political relations of the territory because of its ontological status. The river territory is a body of water that co-builds the shared space other members of the community occupy. The relation between the harbor inhabitants and the river involves practices of world-making. The Orinoco River is an agent characterized by its reciprocity. It gives and takes away, depending on the actions of others. Some seasons the water gives fish, gold, and livelihood. But also, when the river is transformed into a political borderline of the nation, it becomes a site of exploitation and danger where people drown. The importance of the different configuration of vortex aesthetics is that they offer alternative archives of relationships that show the obstacles and possibilities of a culture of reciprocity. These alternative archives claim the value of silenced political agents, such as women and water territories, and fosters well-being in tune with Amerindian cosmologies across the Americas. I will show a couple of images more. There it says "Seven de oro," gold is salt. And here is another picture of one of the indigenous members of the community. Cristina Rivera Garza's novel Autobiography of Cotton is an archival work that reconstructs the story of the journeys of the narrator's grandparents and thousands of nomadic families who worked as cotton farmers on the northeastern border between Mexico and the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. It is the story of how the destructive production of cotton attempted to overcome the aridity of the desert and through agriculture transform the landscape and the lives of so many. The novel denounces different cycles of modernization or destructive production that is characteristic of the transnational neoliberal model, such as the 1994 Free Trade Agreement. The novel describes forms of violence ranging from cotton monoculture to construction of dams and dikes, fracking, maquilas, and the drug wars that are lived today in this border territory where there are mass graves. I argue Cristina Rivera Garza's Autobiografía del Algodón allows us to trace the political agencies of women and plants and the continuities between these agencies which have been silenced. In the form of critical fabulation, a concept of the Afro-American Saidiya Hartman, the novel allows us to reflect on a present in which such extractivist violence does not mediate our political relations, but instead opens possibilities for reflection on political transitions to new situations of coexistence. In other words, through critical fabulation, the text performatively gives textual bodies to invisible agents and shape the territory and propose alternative ways of life different from the dominant ones. The novel gathers an archival work of official and personal sources, including documents, migration records, maps, and photos. Thus, fiction, as a part of an exercise of historical memory and as an experience of thought, serves as a hospitable structure, as a network containing different texts, evidence, narrative, and images. So images will be very important. These are some seals that the writer produced with cotton, and these are some pictures in which she put the history she discovered, the new information of the archive she recovered. To conclude, I want to emphasize that the works of Cristina Rivera Garza and Juanita Escobar are devices that produce counter-histories or counter-stories to confront political ecological violence. In this way, these works contribute to the processes of political transitions that are either already underway or are necessary in countries such as Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela. A counterhistory, according to Saidiya Hartman, is a form of symbolic compensation in the present for the loss of lives in the past or present due to violence. These counterhistories confront the impossibility of fully reconstructing lives and ways of life that have been left out. Reflecting on these agencies allows us to include them in the political community of the future. These works of art perform justice and freedom on the page and make readers the affective witnesses and the architects of new possibilities for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina. Now we have some time for questions. There's one over there and one over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I very much appreciate your presentation. I'm wondering if you can speak to the limits of critical fabulation in terms of being a methodological strategy. And I'm wondering if it is something that is available to all scholars to use when they're writing, and thinking historically, or if critical fabulation needs to be rooted in a particular marginalized experience. What is your thought on that? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I want to start with the context of the concept. Sajida Hartman is an Afro-American historian that works with slavery in the 29th century in the US. And she came up with this concept because she wanted to talk about young women that were victims of sexual abuse in the slave trade, and all the way she was very frustrated because all the ways she could speak about them was in the violent notions that the archive gives about the hearings and about the perpetrators of the violences against them. So she decided to come up with this term of critical fabulation to recover their stories and try to restore agency for them, and with the thinking on the present of other women that are under the same situation. So I think it is useful depending on the problem and on the purposes of the research. In my case, one of the problems is that women are among the main victims of violence in Colombia, and their agency has been diminished by many militaristic military groups. So these works of art work as devices to recover their voices, and there are actual there is a conversation with the social movements as feminism, indigenous social movements that that in that discussion it is important to recover the narratives of previous women and groups. This is one part of the question. It is important for movements nowadays to do that exercise, and on the other hand, this critical fabulation includes a reflection on pictures, on images, and since many voices were silenced in, for example, the African American or the Afro-Colombian or indigenous voices, sometimes they only appear in images or more like on the side, and this is a way of following that line to look at the images. And also there is a third problem, that is the voices and agencies of natural actants. So they have different languages, and critical fabulation, according to Amerindian cosmovisions and research, can be useful to talk about those other perspectives. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Karina, for bringing into our discussion cultural representations, which gives already a hint on what will follow in the next panels. But I'm interested first in how do you make a dialogue between those different media, so images, photographs on the one side, and text, textual rhetoric on the other. So maybe inside Rivera Garza's work, but also in between those different artists. And the second question would be, do you consider also the circulation, the reception of those works? I mean, if they are to overcome violence, is that something for the individual author or photographer? But what about reception, the audience of those books? Thank you.
Thank you very much for both questions. I will begin with the first one. I am very much interested in the hybridity in literary genre because I also think borders and what is the dialogues between different languages allude to building these new languages and these new imaginaries that we need for political transitions. I think they are doing this by mixing those media. I think these artists are trying to imagine and to project different solutions, and they are trying to put in like the materiality of the media is in crisis as the solutions and as the political crisis. It shows, for example, in the tradition of literary criticism in Latin America, the total novel is very important and is very related to nation building. And I think what is here in dispute is precisely new ways of nation building that are in political transition processes. And I think the medium and the hybridity of this dialogue responds to that and responds to new imaginaries that are being built upon those frontiers, upon those borders, not only physical but also symbolical. And about your second question, in the case of Cristina Rivera Garza, she lives in the US, and she also is a very well-known figure in the feminist social movement in Mexico. Her last novel, and that novel is mentioned in Cotton autobiography, like the beginning of that novel is a novel about a feminicide of her sister. It is called El Verano de Liliana, the summer of Liliana. It hasn't been translated yet, and it is about the feminicide of her sister in Ciudad de Mexico in the 80s or 90s, and she is a well-recognized voice that speaks and acts in feminist movements. So I think her political work is very in conversation with her literary work. She also has like some discussions with traditions. She also has defossilized the figure of Juan Rulfo and reflected on agrarian problems on Mexico. And she works both in Mexico and the US. And in the case of Juanita Escobar, she is from Cali, from Cauca, one of the regions that was mentioned in the previous presentation. That is one sector that is highly impacted by violence in Colombia, one of the dangerous places in that aspect. And she lives in the border. She decided from 10 years ago, she lives there, and she collaborates with the woman, the local media, in building like communal newspapers and other humanitarian projects. So also her political work is in dialogue with her artistic work, and she lives like she's part of the community. She also has like the cosmovisions that she's talking about. She reflects that firstly she had like a more distant view, and then she decided to see what were the political implications in which she was also a part as a migrant and woman, and that is how she decided to participate in the community. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Now we are, I think 10 minutes overtime is just fine, and we have to kind of end now this wonderful panel. For the sake of time, I will resist to summarize anything, but I have to say that a really great presentation, and I really enjoyed that, and excellent questions, and I think we had a good discussion. Thanks for that.